Family is a gift from God, a place where love takes root and faith grows stronger each day. It is within the family that we find comfort, support, and the deep connections that shape who we are. Through every joy and every challenge, we lean on one another, held together by love, grace, and shared faith. In moments of prayer, laughter, and even struggle, our hearts are reminded that God's presence lives within our homes and within each relationship we cherish. Family is more than blood. It is a bond of love, trust, and unwavering support. With faith at the center, these connections become our strength, our hope, and our lasting peace.
This morning we'll continue our series, There's No Place Like Home, as we talk about children. I recently heard about a young lady named Leslie who brought her fiancé named Joseph home to meet her parents. And they got there, and the father took Joseph into the study to just get to know who this young man was and just to check him out. And he's talking to Joseph. He says, Joseph, what do you do? He says, well, I study the Bible, and that's what's honorable. Well, do you have any plans for the future? And he said, well, sir, I'm a scholar of the Bible, and I study it hard, and God will take care of our plans for the future. And he said, well, Joseph, how are you going to provide a nice wedding ring for my daughter? And Joseph said, sir, I'll just study the Bible harder, and God will provide. And the father said, what about a home? What are you going to do to provide a nice home for our daughter? And Joseph said, sir, I guarantee you I will just study harder and harder, and God will provide. And they kept having the conversation, and it went sort of like this on for a period of time. And after they finished, Leslie and Joseph went back the place, and the mom asked Dad, well, what did you think about Joseph? Well, he says, he has no job, he has no plans, but the good news is he thinks I'm God. Dad, you ever feel like that? Hey, today we're talking about children. Children. Years around AD 60, and Paul is writing to the church in Ephesus, the new Christians, believers there who are trying to understand how to incorporate following Jesus into every part of their lives. And Paul has talked to them about how as Jesus followers in the community to be in a relationship with each other. He talked about relationships between husbands and wives. And now he turns his attention to this dynamic, very difficult dynamic of the parent-child relationship, how they are to be together as they seek to follow Jesus. And he's saying for the body, the family to hear, adults and children, he says this, children, obey your parents in the Lord. For this is right. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Not simply children obey your parents. You might go to some parent-child book or relationships. They say, well, children should obey your parents. No, he says it and takes it a step further. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. You see, Paul has set down a principle of being Jesus for us in the world and being Jesus with each other. He has said to the church that we are to submit to one another. We are to put others ahead of ourselves. We are to honor them and to be a blessing in Jesus to them. And then he says, and so it is with a wife who is to submit to her husband as unto the Lord. And as it is with a husband who is to sacrifice and give himself up for his wife, Jesus, just as Jesus gave himself up for the church, he says children are to obey their parents and submit to their parents for the sake of Jesus. Obey their parents because they are seeking to follow Jesus. In other words, Jesus is best reflected in the life of a child as they live out their lives in obedience to their parents. And this word obey simply means, from the Greek, to stand under. To stand under. It means to put yourself under another's authority willingly. It's a military term that was used in the Bible to describe a soldier and the officer. And the soldier willingly obeying, of his desire, obeying his senior to do whatever it is that his senior officer wants him to do. And Paul says to the children, do what your parents say, not because you have to or because they make you. Do what your parents are saying because you are following Jesus. And this is the way of Jesus. You know, a big part of following Jesus involves obeying our parents. But then Paul goes deeper, a little bit further, and says, not only should children obey their parents because this is right, but he says, along with obeying our parents, the children should honor their parents. Obey your parents in a way that honors your parents. Honor your father and mother. See, Paul presses in further and moves from the simple acts of obedience to the attitude behind the obedience. Why exactly is a child obeying their parent? Why are they doing what their parents are asking them to do? Because basically Paul understands something, that the attitude of obedience is even more important than the act of obedience. We've all been there, and we've all seen it and experienced it. We've probably done it ourselves. But we know that it's possible to obey with a heart that is seething with disobedience. It's the icy coldness which is perfectly right in its action, but perfectly wrong in its attitude. It's like the little boy. His mother tried to get him to sit down in his chair, and he would not do it. And she said, well, sit down in your chair, and the little boy would not do it. And so the mother takes him and sits him down in his chair, and the little guy crosses his arms and looks up at his mother with glaring eyes and says, I may be sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside. And we have seen that look, haven't we? And we have given our parents that look, haven't we? And that's the wrong attitude. It's wrong because it is not obedience the way Jesus wants it to be, because it dishonors the father and mother. It depersonalizes the parent and makes them an obstacle to what we want to do and accomplish. And it's certainly not right to do that to the person who's given the child life and has tried to honor them and care for them and love them. It's basically saying to them, okay, I'm going to do what you were telling me to do, but I'm going to do it with a really bad attitude because I just want to get my way and I don't care what your way is. See, obedience is not merely an action, it is an attitude. It is an attitude that says, okay, I may not want to do what you're saying, but I will do it, and I'll do it cheerfully, and I'll do it gladly, and I'll do it because I'm living like Jesus wants me to live, who knows our hearts. See, once the child decides to follow Jesus, it's in the obedience, area of obedience, how they treat their parents, where this will become very obvious for them. And so Paul says, okay, obey your parents, for this is right. Then he says, honor your father and mother. And then he says to do this because it will give you a good and long life. He says, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy the long life on the earth. Not only is this the first commandment with a promise, it's the only commandment of the 10 Commandments, which promises a good life because you follow it. Now, on the surface, this sounds superstitious. This sounds like something always been passed down. People have said it. Not sure if it's true. Or even worse, it could come out of sort of a name it and claim it theology. If you just follow Jesus, you will be healthy, wealthy, and wise. But it is not, because Paul is simply saying that glad obedience benefits the children who obey. But an angry, rebelling attitude injures children. It can even shorten their lives. You see, rebelliousness is nothing more than resentment and bitterness. It is resentment and a bitterness. And resentment and bitterness, we can be resentful of another person, we can be bitter towards them. But the reality is we are not hurting them, and the child is not hurting the parent by being resentful and bitter towards them. The child is only hurting themselves. And when resentment and bitterness builds up inside of a child, inside of a person, it begins to eat away at them. It impacts their insides, their digestive system, impairs their mind, makes their skin break out in hives, and causes all the kinds of physical ailments. At least the doctors and psychologists tell us that. And Paul is just highlighting a very real problem. And for a lot of teenagers, this is, in our day and age, just so huge right now. I remember when our children were in high school. Now, Carol and I are not perfect. We're far from it. But I remember them coming home and telling us on more than one occasion about so-and-so who hates their parents, said they hated their parents. And other young people, they tell us they come home and they would trash their parents, speak badly about their parents, and curse their parents. And they'd come back and they'd say, well, I can't wait till I graduate so I can get out of home and get away from my parents, just wanting to remove themselves But our children loved coming home because it was a place that was life-giving and love and safe. Safe. That's why God promises to honor the child, the boy, the girl who honors his or her parents with a long and good life. Children, obey your parents. And obey them in a way that honors your parents. And obey them because it will result in you having a good life, a meaningful life. But then Paul circles back around. He begins with the mother. He begins with the father. And he circles back around after he gets finished with the children and places the responsibility right squarely back on the shoulders of the parents. And he says to them, fathers, and I'm putting their mothers, we're going to be fair here, like equals, do not exasperate your children. Exasperate. You see, it is the desire of the children to follow Jesus by obeying their parents, but it also should be the desire of the mother and dad to follow Jesus by not exasperating their children. Now, this does not mean that you won't upset your child and they're not going to get mad at you if something's small, and because even discipline, good discipline, children will just get mad. It happens. It happens to me. It happens to all of us. That's part of being a child and growing up. But it's not talking about that, these incidents of discipline. It's talking about the parents. And I've seen them who dog their children out. It's talking about the parents who put guilt trips on their children. It's talking about parents who nitpick their children over and over and over. Their child is never good. He is never good enough. She is never good enough. It's talking about the parent who puts so much pressure on their child to succeed and become someone and do something big, that they're always riding them, and to the point that the child becomes rebellious and gets tired of and fed up. And inside of themselves, they say, I cannot take this anymore. And it causes the child to rebel against mom and dad. And you all probably know parents like that. I know parents like that. A number of years ago, we went to lunch with we were a young couple that time, many years ago. We went to lunch with another young couple. Anyway, we had our children. They had their young son, about 3 or 4 years old. And we went and sat down at our table in a restaurant. And as we sat down at our table in the restaurant, the mother reaches into her bag and pulls out a fly swatter. And I'm looking at this, I'm saying, what in the world is that for? And she laid it down on the table. And then her little boy began to act out. And every time he reached for something he shouldn't reach for, or got fidgety, or did something he shouldn't have done, she took that swatter and hit the table. And man, the first time she did that, I jumped. I thought, what's going on here? And every time that little guy did something he shouldn't be doing, and we're sitting in a public setting, and I'm watching this go down, and I'm thinking, what is everybody else thinking here? Now, she didn't hit him, but she was hitting that table. And what should have been a life-giving, wonderful, happy time together as us as families, man, I've got to believe with all my heart that little guy was exasperated once lunch was done, and I can't imagine what it was like at home. I know I was exasperated. And some parents, maybe not to that extreme, but some parents rear their children that way, exasperating them, wearing them out. But Paul says there's a better way. There's a different way. Paul says there's a way that is the way of Jesus. And he says, instead of exasperating your children, instead bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Training is literally the whole life, all of life. As you're with them in their lives, to talk to them. We talked about this last week. To be with them, to encourage them, to strengthen them. All of life, leading them, trying to bring them to Jesus. And instruction are those times, yeah, you have to correct them and set them on the right path. But it's always with intent of comfort and love and the desire that they would become the young man and the young woman they have been created to be. And taken together, Paul simply, I think, is saying training and instruction are simply our parental offering of love, whose purpose is to bring our children to Jesus so he can save them. Training to bring to Jesus. Instruction to bring to Jesus. So that they might consider in our lives as to see the love of Jesus and the patience of Jesus and the care of Jesus, that one day they might decide to give their lives to follow Jesus. Jesus came to earth to save our children. And Jesus came to earth to save us. But just like our children, only we can make that decision to begin to follow Jesus.